Michael, the creams were not worth $16,000 each.
The pharmacies controlled the billing, not my clinic.
Once is a mistake. Twice is suspicious. Dr. Michael Taba wrote unnecessary prescriptions for 141 federal workers' compensation patients across more than 2 years, and left a paper trail for every single one. By the time this footage ends, he will have lost his license, his freedom, and over $13 million.
But your prescriptions made every claim possible.
Without the doctors, none of this gets paid.
He would not be writing prescriptions today. Within 6 hours, federal agents from 4 different inspector general offices would seize his patient files, his bank records, and the sham loan documents that disguised hundreds of thousands of dollars in kickbacks. $21 million in fraudulent prescriptions. 141 injured federal workers. A compound cream mixed in a back room by untrained teenagers for $15 and billed to the Department of Labor for $16,000. By the time Judge Sam Lindsay imposed sentence, the orthopedic surgeon who had taken an oath to do no harm would be facing 102 months in federal prison. Quick question. How much do you actually know about what your doctor is billing your insurance for? Type a number in the comments if you have any idea at all. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that button now. We cover federal healthcare fraud cases like this one every single week, and the numbers only get worse from here. Michael Taba was born in Tehran in the spring of 1964, the second of 3 sons in a middle-class Iranian family. His father was a pharmacist who ran a small neighborhood shop in the Vanik district of North Tehran. His mother was a schoolteacher. The family lived above the pharmacy in a 3rd-floor apartment that smelled, his mother used to say, like menthol and old paper. Michael grew up listening to his father count tablets behind the counter and reading the labels on bottles he could not yet pronounce. He was a quiet boy, detail-oriented, reliable. By the time he was 12, he could already explain to neighborhood customers the difference between a sodium bicarbonate antacid and a calcium carbonate antacid. The revolution changed everything. In 1979, when Michael was 15, his family made the decision to send him to the United States to live with an uncle in Los Angeles. He arrived at LAX in September 1980 with 2 suitcases, $400 in American money sewn into the lining of his coat, and almost no English. He enrolled at Fairfax High School and graduated 3 years later in the top 10% of his class. UCLA accepted him on a partial scholarship. He majored in biology. He worked 30 hours a week at a small compounding pharmacy on Santa Monica Boulevard, mixing topical preparations for a soft-spoken Armenian pharmacist named Levon Sarkisian, who told him on his first day that the most important thing in pharmacy was knowing the difference between what a patient needed and what a patient wanted to be told. He started medical school at UC Irvine in 1986. Orthopedic surgery was a competitive specialty. His professors described him in his evaluations as showing strong aptitude for surgical precision, consistently meeting expectations, and working well under pressure. He matched into an orthopedic residency at a teaching hospital in Pomona. 5 years of 80-hour weeks. 5 years of bone saws and bone grafts, and the specific kind of exhaustion that only orthopedic residents know. He met his wife Soraya during his 2nd year. She was a hospital pharmacist. She thought it was funny that he had grown up above one. They married in 1993 in a small ceremony in Glendale. Their first daughter was born in 1995, their second in 1998. By 2002, Michael Taba was a board-certified orthopedic surgeon, practicing in suburban Los Angeles. He earned a respectable income. He drove a 5-year-old Lexus that he kept washed and waxed in the driveway every Saturday morning. He coached his daughter's youth soccer team in Encino. He sent money home to his parents every month. His patients liked him. His referring physicians liked him. The office manager at his Sherman Oaks practice described him, in a written evaluation from 2005, as the most punctual surgeon she had ever worked for. He performed knee arthroscopies on Tuesdays. He performed rotator cuff repairs on Thursdays. He took call every 4th weekend. For 9 years, that was the rhythm of his professional life. Then came the move to Texas. In 2011, after a hospital merger compressed his California practice and cut his surgical volume in half, Michael accepted an offer from an orthopedic group in McKinney, a fast-growing suburb 30 miles north of Dallas. The compensation was better. The cost of living was lower. The hospital had a brand new surgical wing. Soraya and the girls would stay in California for one more school year, he told himself, and then they would join him. They never did. The girls did not want to leave their friends. Soraya did not want to leave her job at a Westwood pharmacy where she had been for 11 years. Michael flew home one weekend a month. He took an apartment in McKinney near the hospital, a 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a complex that catered to traveling physicians and corporate transfers. He worked, and for the first time in his adult life, he was alone. The U.S. Department of Labor Office of Workers' Compensation Programs, known internally as the DOLOWCP, covers approximately 6 million federal employees across every agency of the executive branch. Letter carriers at the United States Postal Service, Veterans Affairs nurses, TSA officers at airport checkpoints, Customs and Border Protection officers at land ports of entry, National Park Rangers, Forest Service firefighters. Any federal worker who is injured on the job in the course of federal employment becomes, under the Federal Employees Compensation Act of 1916, eligible for medical treatment paid for by the United States government. The system processes more than 200,000 prescription reimbursement claims a year. It is designed for speed and for physician trust. When a federal worker is hurt, a treating physician submits a diagnosis and a treatment plan. The DOLOWCP claims payment pipeline processes the claim, pays the physician for the visit, and pays the pharmacy for the medication. The architecture rests on a single presumption. The presumption that the physician's prescription reflects the physician's honest professional medical judgment. The institutional checks exist on paper. The DOL Office of Inspector General audits the claim stream. The VA OIG and the USPS OIG run parallel oversight on injured workers from their respective agencies, because the affected federal worker population spans the entire executive branch. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division traces the money when allegations surface. The Department of Justice Criminal Division's Healthcare Fraud Strike Force program coordinates the prosecutions. The architecture is, on its face, well designed, but it leans heavily on the integrity of the prescribing physician at the front end of the pipeline. The claims processors at DOLOWCP are not equipped, and were never equipped, to second-guess a board-certified orthopedic surgeon's clinical decision to prescribe a compound topical analgesic for an injured letter carrier with a back complaint. They process the claim. They pay the bill. The vulnerability sits inside one specific category of reimbursement. Compound medications, which are pharmacy-prepared mixtures of 2 or more active ingredients customized to an individual patient's needs, fall into a pricing tier that is fundamentally different from off-the-shelf prescription drugs. A bottle of generic ibuprofen reimburses at a few dollars. A compounded topical analgesic cream, prepared to a physician's specifications, can reimburse at hundreds, thousands, or in extreme cases, tens of thousands of dollars per prescription. The reimbursement ceiling for a single compound cream tube under the DOLOWCP architecture during the relevant period was $16,000. The actual production cost of a tube of compound cream in a legitimate compounding pharmacy ran somewhere between $40 and $200. The arbitrage was the vulnerability. And in May of 2014, 2 men in Texas decided to exploit it. Their names were Dashid Nurian and Christopher Rydberg. Nurian, who went by David, lived in Plano, 10 miles south of McKinney. Rydberg lived in Fort Worth. Between them, they owned and operated 3 pharmacies, 2 in Fort Worth and 1 in Arlington, that on paper looked like ordinary independent compounding pharmacies serving the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex. Behind the dispensing counters, in the back rooms where the actual compound production took place, the operation looked like nothing a state pharmacy board would have recognized. The mixers were teenagers, not pharmacists, not pharmacy technicians, not licensed pharmacy interns or pharmacy students on clinical rotation. untrained teenagers, hired through informal channels, paid in cash or on the books at minimum wage, and shown a recipe card on their first day. They mixed the creams in stainless steel bowls with kitchen spatulas. They scooped the product into plastic squeeze tubes. They labeled the tubes with prescription stickers printed from a pharmacy software terminal in the back office. The cost of producing a single prescription tube of compound cream, including the active ingredients, the petroleum base, the packaging, and the teenager's wages for the 5 minutes the mixing required, came out to approximately $15. The pharmacies then billed the Diol OWCP for as much as $16,000 per prescription. The markup was more than 1,000 times the documented production cost. The Diol OWCP claims processing architecture paid the claims. The pharmacies kept the difference. And the difference, across thousands of prescriptions over 34 months, was enough to fund both a substantial bribe and kickback operation across multiple physicians and a substantial net profit for Nurian and Rydberg, personally. The bribe architecture is where Dr. Michael Taba entered the story. Sometime in the spring of 2014, Taba was approached by Nurian, or by someone working on Nurian's behalf. The proposition was straightforward. Taba would write prescriptions for compound topical analgesic creams for his injured federal worker patients. The pharmacies would fill the prescriptions and bill the DOLOWCP. The pharmacies would in turn pay Taba a portion of the reimbursement, disguised as a series of loans that would never be repaid. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in kickbacks funneled to Taba through a sham loan architecture designed to look, to any auditor, like ordinary arm's-length lending arrangements between a licensed physician and a third-party commercial entity. Taba said yes. The first prescription went out in May 2014. There were dozens more by the end of that summer. By the end of 2014, the pipeline was running at full capacity. Taba's clinical workflow had developed a new routine. A federal worker would come in for an orthopedic complaint, a back strain, a shoulder injury, a knee problem of the kind that occurs every day in a postal sorting facility or a VA hospital ward. Taba would conduct an examination. He would discuss treatment options. And then, regardless of whether the patient's specific clinical presentation actually called for a compounded topical analgesic, Taba would write a prescription for one. The prescriptions did not go to local pharmacies of the patient's choosing. They went, almost without exception, to the Fort Worth and Arlington pharmacies owned by Nurian and Rydberg, 25 to 40 miles from the patient's home. Over the course of 2 years and 10 months, Taba wrote unnecessary compound cream prescriptions for 141 separate federal workers' compensation patients. The aggregate billed value of those prescriptions exceeded $21 million. The actual losses paid out by the DOL OWCP and directly attributable to Taba personally came to $13.1 million. The kickbacks paid to Taba through the sham loan architecture ran into the hundreds of thousands. He knew the creams cost $15 to make. He knew the pharmacies were billing $16,000. He knew the loans were not loans. He knew the patients were receiving a product that delivered no therapeutic benefit. He knew, because some of the patients told him at follow-up appointments, that the creams were producing painful skin rashes on the very backs and shoulders and knees the creams were supposed to be treating. He knew. And he wrote the prescriptions anyway. The broader conspiracy, encompassing Taba and several other physicians whom Nurian and Rydberg had recruited into the same architecture across the Metroplex, billed the DOL OWCP and Blue Cross Blue Shield more than $145 million between May 2014 and March 2017. More recent prosecutorial framing puts the figure closer to $196 million in total fraudulent prescriptions, far above the $158 million initially alleged in the 2019 indictment. Of the billed total, the pharmacies were actually paid more than $90 million for prescriptions that were medically unnecessary, therapeutically ineffective, and in a documented subset of cases actively harmful. The catalyst was not a single moment. It was a slow convergence of federal investigative architecture across multiple inspector general offices, triggered by statistical anomalies that auditors began surfacing inside the DOL-OWCP claims stream itself. By the summer of 2016, the volume of compound cream prescriptions flowing from a small number of Texas pharmacies into the DOL-OWCP reimbursement pipeline had crossed a threshold that auditors at the DOL Office of Inspector General could no longer treat as ordinary variants. The numbers did not look like medicine. They looked like a financial product. A handful of pharmacies in the Fort Worth-Arlington corridor were generating reimbursement claims at billing rates that did not align with any reasonable interpretation of compound medication clinical utility, and the prescriptions feeding those pharmacies were originating from a small, concentrated set of physicians whose prescribing patterns showed almost no clinical variation across patient populations. The DOL-OIG opened a preliminary inquiry. The inquiry pulled in the USPS Office of Inspector General almost immediately. A disproportionate share of the patients whose prescriptions were running through the Fort Worth and Arlington pharmacies were injured postal carriers. The VA Office of Inspector General joined within weeks for the same reason. VA employees, particularly nurses and maintenance staff, were appearing in the patient records at rates that did not match the general federal workforce distribution. By the fall of 2016, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division's Houston field office had attached financial trail analysts to the investigation. Acting Special Agent in Charge, Roderick Benton, supervised the IRS CI work. The Department of Justice Criminal Division's fraud section, operating under the Healthcare Fraud Strike Force program, took the prosecutorial lead. The investigators worked the architecture from both ends simultaneously. From the pharmacy end, they reviewed billing records, employment records, and the actual production logs from the back rooms in Fort Worth and Arlington. From the physician end, they pulled prescription histories, patient files, and bank records for every doctor who had written more than a threshold number of compound cream prescriptions to the suspect pharmacies. Dr. Michael Taba's name surfaced within the first 3 weeks of the physician-side review. His prescription volume was anomalous. His patient demographics were anomalous. The geographic distribution of his patients was anomalous. Federal workers from across the Metroplex were being referred to his McKinney office and walking out with prescriptions destined for pharmacies 25 to 40 miles away. And then there were the loans. The IRS CI financial trail analysts traced a pattern of large deposits into Taba's accounts from entities connected to Nurian and Rydberg, each deposit structured as a loan, each loan documented by attorneys, each loan unaccompanied by any record of repayment. The agents had what they needed to keep building. The investigation continued in silence for another 14 months. By early 2018, the federal investigative architecture had assembled a near-complete picture of the scheme. The smoking gun, when it crystallized, was not a single document. It was a pricing architecture so brazen that it functioned as its own confession. Subpoenaed pharmacy records documented the per-prescription cost of producing the compound creams at approximately $15. The same pharmacy records documented the reimbursement claims submitted to the DOL-OWCP at amounts up to $16,000 per prescription. The pricing arbitrage was more than 1,000 to 1. There was no clinical, regulatory, or commercial framework under which that markup could be characterized as legitimate. Investigators interviewed former employees of the Fort Worth and Arlington pharmacies. The teenagers came forward. They described the back rooms. They described the recipe cards taped to the inside of cabinet doors. They described how they had been told what to scoop, what to mix, and what to label, and how no licensed pharmacist had supervised any part of the process they were responsible for. They described coming in after school, mixing creams for 2 or 3 hours at a stretch, and leaving with $12 an hour in cash. They had been 17 and 18 years old. They had not understood, at the time, what they were participating in. The patients came forward next. Federal workers who had received the creams testified that the creams did not work. The pain they had been prescribed the creams for did not diminish. In a documented subset of cases, the creams produced painful, irritating skin rashes, red inflamed patches that burned when the product was applied and worsened over the days that followed. Patients had complained to Taba. Taba had renewed the prescriptions anyway. The financial trail was the third pillar. IRSCI traced the kickbacks from the pharmacy accounts to Taba's accounts. The transfers had been structured as loans. The loan documents existed. They had been drafted by attorneys. They bore signatures and dates and notarial seals. But the payments that, in a legitimate lending arrangement, would have flowed back from Taba to the pharmacies, the principal, the interest, the amortization schedule, did not exist. The loans were not loans. They were kickbacks dressed in loan paperwork. In 2019, a federal grand jury in the Northern District of Texas returned an indictment against Nurian, Rydberg, Taba, and several co-defendants. The initial indictment described a scheme valued at $158 million. A subsequent superseding indictment expanded the charges and the scope. By the time of sentencing, the prosecutorial framing would describe a scheme totaling approximately $196 million in fraudulent prescriptions, of which more than $90 million had actually been paid out by the federal government and by Blue Cross Blue Shield to the 3 Texas pharmacies. We're heading into the trial now. If you want to see exactly how the federal system handles a doctor who turned his prescription pad into a kickback pipeline, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We cover healthcare fraud strike force cases mainstream media won't touch, and the verdict in this one is worth sticking around for. The confrontation in this case did not arrive in the form of a dramatic arrest at a clinic. It arrived in the form of federal agents at Dr. Michael Taba's home in McKinney on a weekday morning in the fall of 2019. The agents identified themselves. They presented the warrant. They explained, in the measured procedural language that federal agents use in moments like these, that Dr. Taba was being charged in connection with a federal healthcare fraud investigation conducted jointly by the Department of Labor, the Postal Service, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and the Internal Revenue Service. Taba was wearing the clothes he wore to the hospital. He had a coffee cup in his hand. The agents asked him to put the cup down. He put the cup down. He asked one question. "Is this about the prescriptions?" The lead agent did not answer directly. He asked Taba to confirm his identity. Taba confirmed it. "I have a wife in California," Taba said. "I need to call her." "You'll be permitted a phone call shortly," the agent replied. Taba was processed and released on conditions pending arraignment. The conditions included surrender of his passport, restrictions on travel outside the Northern District of Texas, and reporting requirements to pretrial services. He was permitted, under the pretrial release terms, to continue practicing medicine pending resolution of the criminal case. His medical license, at that moment, was still active. His hospital privileges were still in effect. His patients did not yet know. In the weeks that followed, Taba retained federal criminal defense counsel out of Dallas. His attorneys laid out the options: cooperation, plea agreement, trial. The United States Attorney's Office offered terms that would have required a guilty plea and substantial cooperation against Nurian and Rydberg. Taba declined them. He maintained that his prescriptions had reflected his honest professional medical judgment. He maintained that the loans had been loans. He maintained that he had been targeted because of the federal investigative architecture's preference for high-profile physician defendants over the harder-to-prosecute pharmacy principals. His case went to trial. The trial in the Northern District of Texas opened in November of 2023. Trial attorney Ethan Womble of the Department of Justice Criminal Division's Fraud Section and acting assistant chief Catherine Wagner led the prosecution. The case was tried before a federal jury under the Healthcare Fraud Strike Force Program architecture. The prosecution called federal investigators from the DOL-OIG, the USPS-OIG, the VA-OIG, and IRS-CI. They called former pharmacy employees, including 2 of the teenagers from the Fort Worth back room, both now in their early 20s. They called federal worker patients who had received the creams. One of the patients, a postal letter carrier from Fort Worth with a chronic lower back injury, testified that the cream Dr. Taba had prescribed her had produced a rash across her lower back that took 6 weeks to heal. She had told Taba about the rash at her next appointment. He had written her another prescription for the same cream. She testified that she had thrown the second tube in her kitchen trash on the drive home and never picked up a third. The prosecution introduced the pricing documents. $15 per prescription to produce. $16,000 per prescription to bill. The jury heard the arbitrage explained in detail through the testimony of an IRSCI forensic accountant who walked them through the pharmacy production logs side by side with the DOL-OWCP billing records. The prosecution introduced the sham loan architecture. The jury saw the documents that called the Kickbacks loans and the bank statements that proved no loan repayment had ever taken place. The defense argued professional medical judgment. The defense argued that Taba had relied on the pharmacy's representations about the appropriateness of the compound cream formulations. The defense called character witnesses. 64 character reference letters would eventually be submitted to the court on Taba's behalf, from colleagues and former patients and members of his Iranian-American community in California and Texas. The jury deliberated. On November 16, 2023, the federal jury returned a verdict on all 4 counts of the superseding indictment. 1 count of conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud. 3 counts of healthcare fraud. Guilty, 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 guilty. Sentencing was scheduled for the following year, and then continued again. Taba was placed on home confinement pending sentencing. 27 months on an ankle monitor, restricted to his McKinney residence, unable to travel to California to see his wife or his now adult daughters. The Texas Medical Board suspended his medical license. His board certification in orthopedic surgery was revoked. The hospital privileges he had held since 2011 were terminated. The orthopedic group that had recruited him from California in 2011 quietly removed his name from the office signage. Sentencing took place on February 24, 2026, before United States District Judge Sam Lindsay. The federal sentencing guidelines minimum, calculated on the loss amounts attributable to Taba personally, was 151 months, 12.5 years in federal prison. Judge Lindsay deviated downward. He acknowledged the 64 character letters. He acknowledged the 27 months of pre-sentence home confinement. He acknowledged the loss of medical license and surgical certification, the destruction of a career that had taken 3 decades to build. He balanced those mitigating factors against the depth and the duration of the conduct and the harm done to 141 federal workers who had trusted the prescription pad of a board-certified orthopedic surgeon. "There's a lot of healthcare fraud," Judge Lindsay said from the bench, "and without doctors participating, it would be wiped out." The judge characterized Taba, in the sentencing statement, as more involved in the fraud than willing to admit. The sentence was 102 months in federal prison, 8.5 years. Restitution was set at more than $13 million. Assistant Attorney General A. Tyson Duva of the Department of Justice Criminal Division addressed the press after sentencing. "It serves as a reminder," he said, "that medical professionals who violate the trust society places in them, their oath, the law, and harm Americans for personal enrichment will be investigated and prosecuted." Dolo IG. Inspector General Anthony P. Desposito issued his own statement. Dr. Michael Taba accepted bribes and kickbacks for writing thousands of prescriptions for unnecessary compounded medications issued to injured federal workers covered by the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Workers' Compensation Programs, putting illegal profits above patient safety. Taba reported to the Federal Bureau of Prisons in the spring of 2026. His projected release date is in 2034. He will be approximately 70 years old when he walks out of federal custody.